Hey guys, welcome back to r/Maliciouscompliance. In this new Ripestories video, my boss replaced me with a new coworker who said she could do my job faster. He told me to stop asking questions and do exactly what she said. So I did, and 3 days later the power plant emergency alarms were screaming and my company was about to lose a whole lot of money. And the first one is titled, New Karen Coworker Steals My Job and Instantly Causes $500,000 in Damages. So I work as an industrial millwright. For those who might not know what that is, we are the mechanics who build, rebuild and maintain massive industrial machinery. My specific area of expertise is rebuilding natural gas and steam turbines at power plants. These machines are absolute monsters. They weigh hundreds of tons, take up entire buildings and generate the electricity that powers cities. It is heavy, dirty, and highly critical work. On my crew, everyone has a specific role. We travel from plant to plant, living out of suitcases in cheap hotels for months at a time, so we all get to know each other's strengths and weaknesses very quickly. My job for the last 5 years has been the alignment specialist. When you rebuild a turbine, you have to connect it to a generator. The turbine spins, turns a massive shaft, and spins the generator. And the place where the turbine shaft meets the generator shaft is called the coupling. My job is to make sure those two shafts are perfectly aligned before we bolt them together. And when I say perfectly aligned, I don't mean it just looks straight to the naked eye. I mean we measure the alignment down to the thousandth of an inch. To give you an idea of how small that is, a piece of standard printer paper is about 0.003 of an inch thick. If the alignment between the turbine and the generator is off by even a few thousandths, the resulting vibration can destroy the machine, even it gets up to its operating speed of 3,600 revolutions per minute. Because of how critical this is, I take my time, I use precision laser alignment tools, and I calculate the exact thickness of the stainless steel shims we need to put under the massive turbine supports to raise or lower it. We use heavy hydraulic jacks to lift the casing, slide the shims in, lower it back down and measure again. It is slow, tedious work and sometimes it takes me a full 12-hour shift just to get the alignment exactly where it needs to be. But in 5 years I've never had a machine vibrate or fail on startup. But then Karen joined our crew. Karen transferred in from another division. She was a loud talker who constantly bragged about her experience, telling everyone that she's the best at what she does and that we are below her. From her very first day, she made it her mission to get close to our superintendent. She brought him his favorite coffee every morning and she laughed at all his terrible jokes. She always managed to be standing right next to him when the big plant managers walked by. She also made it her mission to go after my job. Alignment is considered a premium task on a turbine deck. You don't have to swing heavy sledgehammers or get covered in thick black grease all day. It requires brains over brawn, and Karen wanted that spot and she started laying the groundwork immediately. Whenever she walked past me while I was taking my laser readings, she would make comments loud enough for the superintendent to hear. She would look at her watch and say things like, "Still on the same step? At my last plant, we would have had this buttoned up yesterday." Or she would tell the boss, "You know, if we picked up the pace on the alignment, we could hand the unit back to the plant ahead of schedule and secure that early completion bonus." Our superintendent was a guy who cared about exactly two things, schedule and budget, and he didn't care about the technical details, he just wanted the job done fast so he looked good to the corporate office. Karen's constant whispering in his ear started to work. He began rushing me, asking why I was taking so long and questioning my shim calculations. About a month into major turbine overhaul, the plant manager put pressure on our superintendent. We were 2 days behind schedule because of some bad replacement parts we received from the manufacturer. The superintendent called a morning safety meeting and made an announcement saying, "We need to make up time," he told the crew. "Karen is gonna take over the primary alignment duties starting today. She has a faster method she used at her last site. OP, you're stepping down from alignment. You will be on gasket duty and casing bolting. I want you assisting Karen. Whatever she tells you to do, you do it." I was angry. I knew my job better than anyone else there, and I knew the quirks of these specific machines, but I also knew better than to argue in front of the whole crew. And yeah guys, as seasoned veterans of r/Maliciouscompliance, you can probably already tell what is coming, but before we read that, if you enjoy these Malicious Compliance company/business stories, then please don't forget to like the video and maybe post some star emojis in the comments if you want to support me. Also, since that issue popped up quite a few times in the past couple of weeks, if you ever see any channels reposting my videos, especially with my voice, then please feel free to send me the links to these channels in an email. My business email is ripereddit@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your help. So I pulled the superintendent aside after the meeting and I told him that rushing an alignment on a machine this size was a massive risk. I explained that Karen was not familiar with this specific model of gas turbine and that every manufacturer has different tolerances. He waved me off completely. He told me I was just being defensive because I lost my cushy spot, and he explicitly ordered me to focus on torquing the bolts and to follow Karen's lead without arguing and to not ask any questions. Well, so I did exactly that. The next day, it was time to align the two shafts. I was busy working on the lower casing, installing massive bolts and using a heavy hydraulic torque wrench to tighten them down. It is loud, physically exhausting work, and meanwhile, Karen set up the laser alignment kit on the coupling. To understand what happened next though, you need to understand one crucial rule about turbine alignment. It is called thermal growth. Basically, when a machine is sitting still and turned off, it is at room temperature. We call this cold. But when you fire up a gas turbine, the exhaust temperatures can reach over 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. Metal expands when it gets hot. The turbine gets extremely hot, so the metal expands upwards. The generator, however, stays relatively cool, so it doesn't expand nearly as much. Because of this, you never align the two shafts perfectly straight when the machine is cold. If you do that, the turbine will grow upwards when it gets hot and the shafts will be completely out of line and the machine will tear itself apart. Instead, you gotta do a cold offset. So you calculate exactly how much the turbine will grow and you deliberately set the turbine lower than the generator while it is cold. The engineering manual gives you the exact target numbers. For this specific unit, the turbine needed to be set precisely 0.045 inches lower than the generator. I was working about 10 feet away from Karen and I watched her read the laser display. She was calling out orders to the rigging crew, having them jack up the turbine and slide shims under the feet. After about 2 hours, she proudly called the superintendent over. She pointed at the digital display on the laser computer and I looked at the screen from where I was standing. The numbers read 0.000 for the vertical alignment. She had aligned it dead center, perfect, zeroed out. She had essentially completely ignored the thermal growth offset and she had aligned it perfectly for a cold machine, which meant it was gonna be an absolute disaster the moment it got hot. I put down my hydraulic wrench and walked over. I looked at the screen, then looked at Karen. "Are you sure about those numbers?" I asked her. "Did you check the thermal offset targets in the engineering manual?" Karen rolled her eyes. She looked at the superintendent and sighed dramatically. "See what I mean?" she said to the boss. "The alignment is locked in and within tolerance. OP's just mad that I did it in 2 hours instead of 12. The superintendent did not even look at the laser computer. He just saw the completed paperwork and the 10 hours of schedule saved. I looked right at the superintendent. "Boss," I said clearly, "if we bolt this coupling together at 0,0, the machine is gonna vibrate when it heats up." Karen stepped right into my personal space. "I've been doing this for years. Bolting it together straight means it runs straight. Now go do your job and torque the flanks like you were told." I looked at the superintendent again. He nodded in agreement with her. "Okay," I said. "You are the boss. I will go torque the bolts." I went back to my station. I did exactly what I was told. I spent the next 2 days building gaskets, cleaning, mating surfaces, and torquing heavy bolts. Karen finished her paperwork, signed off on the alignment sheet, and handed it to the superintendent. The superintendent was thrilled because Karen had shaved an entire shift off the schedule, and he even brought a box of donuts to the trailer to celebrate getting back on track. 3 days later, the mechanical work was finished. We cleared our tools off the deck and handed the machine over to the plant operators for the startup sequence. And when you start a gas turbine, you don't just turn a key. It is a slow, methodical process that takes hours. First, the massive loop oil pumps turn on, flooding the bearings with thick oil, and then a turning gear slowly rotates the massive rotor just to make sure nothing is rubbing internally. Our whole crew stood on the turbine deck wearing our hard hats and earplugs, watching the massive machine start to wake up. The plant control room initiated the ignition sequence and the starting motor spun the turbine up. You could hear the low rumble as the natural gas ignited in the combustion chambers. The floor beneath our boots began to vibrate gently and the turbine reached 1000 RPM. Everything sounded normal, it was still relatively cool. But then it hit 2000 RPM and the internal temperature started climbing rapidly. The metal casing of the turbine began to expand just like physics dictates. At 2500 RPM, the gentle vibration beneath our boots turned into a harsh, aggressive shaking. You could feel it rattling your teeth. Karen was standing next to the superintendent. She was looking nervous, chewing on her bottom lip. The superintendent was staring at the machine with his hands on his hips. At 3000 RPM, the vibration became violent. The heavy metal grating we were standing on started bouncing. A high-pitched screeching sound echoed off the corrugated metal walls of the building. It sounded like a massive piece of chalk dragging across a chalkboard. Suddenly, the warning klaxons in the building started blaring. Orange strobe lights flashed on the walls. A voice from the control room came over the plant radio system. High vibration on bearing number 2, high vibration on bearing number 3. Temperatures are spiking. The screeching sound got louder. Thick white smoke began pouring out of the bearing housings on top of the machine. The smell of burning oil and hot metal filled the air, choking us. "We are tripping the unit," the radio blared. "Emergency trip, emergency trip." The main fuel valve slammed shut. The roaring fire inside the machine died instantly, but the massive rotor weighing over 50 tons was still spinning at 3000 RPM. It takes a very long time for that much weight to coast down to a complete stop. For the next 10 minutes, we stood there in absolute silence, listening to the agonizing sound of metal grinding against metal as the rotor slowly coasted to a halt. Smoke continued to billow out of the vents and pool near the ceiling, and the plant manager came sprinting out of his office and onto the turbine deck. His face was bright red and he was breathing heavy. He walked straight up to our superintendent. "What the hell just happened?" the plant manager screamed over the residual noise. "We just wiped the bearings. The vibration probes maxed out the charts." Our superintendent looked pale. He turned to Karen. "What did you do?" Karen stammered. "I didn't do anything. The alignment was perfect. It was all zeros." The plant manager stopped yelling and stared at her. "What do you mean it was all zeros? The laser readout," Karen said, her voice shaking now. "I got it 0 to 0. It was perfectly straight." The plant manager took off his hard hat and ran his hands over his face. He looked like he wanted to be sick. "You're saying you aligned a hot running gas turbine to 0 cold?" the plant manager asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You didn't put the thermal offset in?" Karen looked completely lost. "It was straight," she repeated weakly. The plant manager turned back to our superintendent. "Get your crew to open up the bearing housings right now." We spent the next 12 hours undoing all the heavy work we had just finished. We unbolted the heavy steel covers, rigged them up, and lifted them off with the overhead crane. The damage was catastrophic. Inside the turbine, the spinning shaft rests on what are called Babbitt bearings. They are lined with a soft metal alloy that is designed to support the shaft on a thin film of pressurized oil. Because the turbine had expanded upwards as it got hot, the alignment was violently thrown off. The shaft had bowed under the extreme stress and breaking through the oil film and grinding directly into the bearing metal. The Babbitt metal was completely melted and wiped away. It looked like smeared peanut butter. The heavy bronze shells that held the bearings were warped and cracked from the intense heat. Worse than that though, the labyrinth seals which keep the oil inside the bearing housings had been crushed and they were rubbed completely smooth and ruined. And the absolute worst part, the main rotor shaft itself, the 50-ton piece of precision-engineered steel, had deep, jagged score marks carved into it where it had dragged across the destroyed bearings. The plant manager stood looking at the destroyed components, his face pale and furious. "Do you have any idea what this is gonna cost?" he shouted at our superintendent. 4 new bearing sets, new seals, bringing out a specialty machining crew for the rotor journal. This is easily $500,000 screw up. And that's not even counting the lost megawatt revenue for the downtime. Your company is paying for every single cent of this. The superintendent looked physically ill. He turned to Karen. "You told me you knew how to do this." "I do," Karen yelled defensively. She pointed directly at me and said, "OP was standing right there. He saw me do it. Why didn't he stop me?" The superintendent and the plant manager both looked at me. I slowly wiped the oil off my hands with the shop rag. I looked right at the superintendent. 3 days ago, I said calmly. I asked her if she checked the thermal offset targets and she told me to stick to the torque wrench. I told you that if we bolted it together at 0, it would vibrate, and you told me to go torque the horizontal joint and just follow her orders. The superintendent opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "I have the alignment sheets right here," the plant manager said, pulling a manila folder out of his jacket. He flipped it open, signed and dated by Karen, verified and countersigned by you, superintendent. OP's name is not even on this document anywhere. The plant manager closed the folder. He pointed at Karen. "I don't want her touching any critical part of my site ever again," the plant manager said. "Superintendent, put her on fire watch or have her sweep the deck." The superintendent immediately stripped Karen of all her mechanical duties, demoting her to cleaning up oil dry. She spent the rest of the week sweeping floors in absolute silence, her face bright red, before corporate finally processed her termination. The superintendent walked away to make the hardest phone call of his career. Later that afternoon, the superintendent came back out to the deck and he looked 10 years older. He called me over. "Karen has been removed from the project entirely," he said quietly. "Corporate is reviewing her employment status. They are flying in emergency replacement parts, and when they get here, I need you to do the alignment. It's gonna take me 12 hours. I told him, "Take 24 if you need to," he replied. Some time later, we rebuilt the bearings. We worked with the specialty machinists to polish the rotor shaft as best as we could to remove the score marks, and when it was finally time for the alignment, I set up my lasers. I spent a full shift making tiny adjustments, jacking the heavy casing up and down, and sliding the thin stainless steel shims into place. I set the turbine exactly 0.045 inches lower than the generator, and when we finally fired the machine up the second time, we all stood on the deck and watched. It rolled up to 1000 RPM, then 2000, then 3000, and it was smooth as glass. The vibration monitors in the control room showed readings that were well below the alarm limits. The machine heated up, the turbine expanded upwards exactly as the engineers had calculated, and the two shafts came into perfect dead center alignment while running at full load. Karen was officially fired by our corporate office shortly after that. Insurance had to pay out the massive claim for the destroyed parts and the plant downtime. The superintendent received a heavy reprimand and was told that if he ever rushed a critical technical procedure again, he would be joining Karen in the unemployment line. He never rushed me again. For the rest of the time I worked under him, whenever it came time for the alignment, he would just hand me the paperwork and walk away. He let me do my job exactly the way it needed to be done. And the next one is another brilliant story from r/Maliciouscompliance, and it is titled, "Think about if you want to be employed here." Will do, boss. And by the way, guys, if you enjoy these stories, please let me know where you are watching from today. So this is from over a decade ago, but it's the only time I've ever quit a job and thought you all might enjoy it. So I worked for Target on their overnight team, 10 p.m. to 6:30 a.m., and eventually a specialist position came up for which I applied and was granted. So this was the position of receiver, scheduled to work 6 a.m. to 2:30 p.m., which basically was the person who would take in vendor orders. In other words, not things that were sent straight from corporate, but instead the Coca-Cola guy or the Lay's potato chip guy, and specialty orders that came in at times other than the main truck. This was a job where instead of one major task, you dealt with about 20 minor ones throughout the day, and your day varied based on the whims of the people who are bringing things into you. We had a delivery cutoff of 12 p.m., but management would always say just take things no matter when they came. I generally was really good about managing my time and making sure if I needed to stay late for something important, I did, and if it was something minor, say the Harlequin romance books that would wait overnight to process, I would get it first thing in the morning. I had a good rapport with my boss and I got great reviews, but then my boss got a promotion and my new boss was a piece of work. The new boss, we can call him John because that was his name, F you John, was a tyrant of the pettiest type. He would wonder why things were left overnight when I wasn't busy earlier in the day when he saw me, because I'd completed all my tasks and I cannot make UPS come faster than they do. When Target's corporate told my department it was busy enough for a 20-hour-a-week worker, he refused to let me get anyone for longer than my 30-minute lunch breaks. The straw that broke my back was P-Fresh. For those of you who did not work at Target in the early 2000s, P-Fresh was what they called their new initiative to have groceries in the stores. It was a big deal for them, and my store was one of the pilot stores in our area. I would be the first person to have to deal with it, and then I would have to teach receivers in the area how it works by having them shadow me for a day at my store and me at theirs when they got their fresh food. The fresh food came in a separate truck that arrived at 4 a.m., and I expected, like I was informed, that I would simply have to process it first thing in the morning when I got to work, but instead, John decided that my schedule was going to be changed to 4 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Getting up at 3 a.m. to be at work at 4 a.m. was not fun, but I dealt with it because I was a team player. However, John still insisted that I needed all of my work done by the time I left at 12:30 p.m., an impossibility when the cutoff for deliveries was 12 p.m. I still prioritized things as good as I could, and nothing urgent was left undone for more than 24 hours. When Target was pretty good at making sure we had plenty of time to receive things before they had to hit the floor for street dates and such. The straw that broke my back, though, was when the specialist position was terminated. Basically, Target wanted those special positions in the normal chain of command, which is fine. However, when they did this, they also gave lots of power to John. And you see, it was in my old position that I had weekends off, because people don't deliver on weekends, and was not required to work holidays, along with being a guaranteed 40-hour-a-week M to F position. When this change came through, HR informed us that we had a week to decide whether we wanted the position or if we wanted to go to another position in the company or if we wanted severance. HR informed me that nothing would really be changing with my job because it was still important, whereas other jobs like the jewelry counter were not considered as important and were being rolled in with other things. I was going to stay with the position until John brought me into the office later that day. He told me he was tired of my poor attitude involving getting things done, so he was changing my schedule to a split shift. Basically, he wanted me to come in from 4 to 5 a.m. and then go home for an hour, then come back at 6 a.m. and work until 1:30 p.m. And he also told me that any overtime would no longer be allowed and that I would have to start working 1 weekend a month and holidays. He also wrote me up for something that I didn't do, but the person who covered my lunches did under the guise of me not training them properly. His exact words were, "You need to think long and hard about how you're working and think about if you want to be employed here in a month." I told him he was absolutely right, so I told him I would be right back. I had to run to the test room, but instead I went to HR and told them I'm taking the severance, and as it was 12:25 p.m., I'm guessing this is my last day. I then got to go back to John and tell him what I just said, and he told me that I had to come back the next week to train my replacement. I walked out of that building happier than I had been in the last 3 years working there. I got texts over the next few months of the fallout. The receiving department was a ducking nightmare for months, and since I was the only one who knew how to handle their refrigerated trucks, they lost an entire truck worth of merchandise that week. That was not a good look for them. Additionally, corporate had to send out people from out of the area to cover all of the training I was supposed to provide, which cost them a lot of money and made corporate even more pissed at John. Last I heard, he had been let go and the next place he worked fired him for sexual harassment. I had a month's vacation where I got totally prepared for World of Warcraft Cataclysm and then I took a new job. I was happy as a clam. And by the way guys, if you've watched this far, let me know in the comments what is your favorite MMO. And the next one is a story from r/Maliciouscompliance and it is titled ASM gives me more work and it backfires spectacularly. So I work at Home Depot as a lot associate. My main job duties involve collecting cards from the lot and being on call to help customers load heavy items into their vehicles. Since I'm typically the only lot person scheduled during my shift, this means I'm running back and forth trying to help customers and get cards. It really is a job that needs 2 people, one on each end of the store, but it is just me. Now, I can usually handle this, but when I'm assigned other projects on top of that, it is too much. On one such day, the head cashier, aka supervisor, who we will call Karen, usually a nice lady but has Karen tendencies as you would see, told me that Kyle, ASM, had such a project for me. He wanted me to clean out an area at the side of the store and move a bunch of carts there. This was gonna take at least a couple of hours because the area was such a mess. And since this was during the summer when the store was busier than usual, I would be constantly interrupted with loading calls and trying to maintain the lot. And yeah, this is where the malicious compliance comes in. Kyle wanted me to focus on cleaning that area, which I did. It ended up taking 5 hours. Bear in mind that I also answered several loading calls during that time. The problem though, I didn't spend any of that time collecting cards, so after those 5 hours, the lot was a huge mess of cards scattered about. Karen was not happy about it, as she gets really picky about the lot being free of cards, but I looked her dead in the eye and told her that I was just doing what her and Kyle told me to do. I then went on lunch while associates from other departments had to round up all the cards. After that, Kyle never asked me to take on other projects again. Thank you for watching, I will see you again tomorrow.